Good morning. Welcome to Southwoods. Thrilled that you're here this morning. My name is Clark Smith. I'm a sinner saved by grace. I thank Greg for filling in for me the last couple weeks. Greg's out with the other half of the church that's all camping down in Table Rock. I'm glad Greg has camping. I think if it weren't for camp, he doesn't like camping, but that's where he gets all his sermon illustrations, if you recall. So anyway, they're off having fun there, and we're having fun here. And if I forget to mention it at the end of my sermon, please hang around when we're done. There's donut holes and juice and fruit and everything good. So please get your kids and just hang out and have a time of fellowship. I think I'm a pretty funny guy. 3 or 4 years ago, before any of my 4 boys were thinking about building families, I was sitting around watching UFC or something, and I thought, I need to come up with a name for my grandkids. I didn't have any grandkids, none on the horizon. I need to come up with a name for my collective grandkids, and something unique. So I came up with Grandies. And that's what I call, when we talk in the future about all the grandkids, the Grandies, one by one, they're Grandy. This is an official entry at UrbanDictionary.com. If you know what that's about, that's the only definition you can look up at Urban Dictionary. If you don't know what it's about, don't go there. But anyway, it's all official. And so I began to think about grandchildren and babies and stuff like that. I want to introduce you to my second oldest son, Noah. Aww. This is Noah. Noah has gotten himself married to a beautiful angel of a wife. She's just the love of my life, the only girl in our family at this point, full time. There's some itinerant ones. Noah and Tiffany had moved to San Francisco. They lived with us for a year, and then they took a job out in San Francisco, and they called us in, May, June. And, when you get a call from your son, with Facebook and email and everything, it's rare to get a call, and sure enough, get the call that they were going to have a grandbaby. The funny thing, I guess, about it is Noah was born 2 days after our anniversary. So he totally ruins our anniversary every year because we can't take time and go do our thing because we got to be planning his birthday. Well, the good news, and that rascal got married December 19, 7 days before Christmas. So I'm planning a wedding instead of just paybacks. Their babies due right at the time of their anniversary. So now they're going to be absorbed in baby stuff and birthdays and all that instead of their own anniversary and Christmas. So just desserts. Well, Noah and Tiffany, let me tell you about this. Is Don't You Wish Babies Came with an Owner's Manual? Mm-hmm. Well, this one did. Actually, this is a book I published in another lifetime. It's so old there's no UPC code on the back. But Noah actually graced the cover of this book that, like I say, in another lifetime I did, Baby Owner's Manual by Ed Christopherson. And, this is good. This is how to bathe baby and night feedings and stuff like that, ears, how to clean them and all that stuff. But, the important thing about babies, I think you all know, and we're videotaping this. Noah and Tiffany hang on my every word, so let's give them some help. What do babies do when they're hungry?
Cry.
They cry. What do babies do when they're sleepy? They cry. What do babies do when they wake up? What do babies do if there's some business down south they need you to take care of? What do? They cry. Babies cry. And so here's the question for the day. When do we stop acting like babies? When do we get over that behavior? I don't want to mention it, but he's running the video camera back here today. I actually had a 5-year-old in my house one time when he found out there was not going to be any dessert after dinner, began to cry. So, sorry, Jonathan. All right, so I'm wondering, when do we get over that behavior that we learn, that we're born with? How does someone behave who is overworked? Someone who feels unappreciated? How do you behave when you're fatigued? How do you behave when you're financially strapped and you just feel that vice? How do you behave when you're jilted by a lover? How do you behave if you have no father figure? How do you behave when you're cut off on the highway? Greg did a great job last week, great sermon last week, talking about feeling guilt over past sin. How do people behave when they feel those pressures, those tensions in their life? How do they behave? Have you ever played the Have You Ever game? Let's play the Have You Ever game. Have you ever been bullied? Have you ever worked with someone who just seemed to have it out for you? I see some smiles. No hands now, but have you ever lived with someone who just seemed to have it out for you? No hands. Have you ever been accosted by a beggar? I mean accosted. Give me your change. Have you ever encountered someone who thought that you owed them something? Have you ever encountered somebody, ever had to deal with someone who had a Napoleon complex? You know what that is? The little man trying to act big. Have you ever been around somebody who's trying to live larger than, make you think they're bigger than their body size would indicate? Have you ever been griped out simply because someone else had a bad day at work? Have you ever suffered the consequences of being around someone who is medicating their inner pain with drugs and alcohol? Have you ever been around people in those circumstances? Well, today's message is anchored in this thought. I asked God for wisdom, and He said, "What do you see?" I said, "What I see in the world is that people tend to be unattractive in their area of greatest need." People tend to be unattractive in their area of greatest need. Now, you're grown-ups, right? You understand that attractive can mean behavior, right? That's kind of where I've been leaning with this. I said this one time to a lady, and she actually thought I was calling her unattractive in her area of greatest need. We tend to act out in unattractive ways or unproductive ways, unhelpful ways. We tend to act out our needs, the needs of our life. Can't find another word. We often tend to act them out in ways that push people away. So instead of getting what we need, listen, you have a tough day at work. The boss didn't like anything you did. Maybe you feel tense. Maybe you feel like your job's on the line. And you come home, and how do you deal with the people around you? Well, here's the thing. You don't have any reserve energy. You just spend it all at work. So whatever goes wrong in the house, it sets you off. That's human nature. But when you act it out or play it out on other people, now you're wounding them because of stuff that's in your own life. People tend to be unattractive in their area of greatest need. Now, this is something that I've had in my mind for a long time. This is something I find to be true. Every time I turn around, I see it proven again and again. But now, here's the thing. I'm going to accuse modern-day Christianity of getting out of its playground. And a lot of times, Christianity gets over into the pop psychology field. A lot of times, we spend our time talking about how to, live positively and think positively and all this kind of stuff, and that's fine, but Dr. Phil kind of has that covered. And I don't want to waste your time talking about something that the Bible isn't making fully clear, that the Bible doesn't focus on. So I asked myself, is there a biblical foundation for this? And these verses just race over my mind. If you brought your Bible, open to Matthew chapter 5. If you don't have a Bible, there's one on the seat tray in front of you. As always, you can go to Got Pure Milk. I don't have it up here, but it's in your bulletin. GotPureMilk.com/people.htm. And there you will have the text in front of you. But Matthew chapter 5, boy, Jesus, this is Sermon on the Mount, right? This is the first shot out of the cannon. And he's covering all this ground. And in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44 through 47, I actually think I'm going to start from 43, Jesus talks about this exact thing. He says, you have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Okay, that just makes sense, doesn't it? But he flips the script. He says, but I say to you, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Love those who behave toward you in an unattractive way. Love them, Jesus says. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you'll be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. If you only love those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you are only kind to your friends, how different are you from anyone else? Even pagans do that. Now, when we hear Jesus talking about persecution, we immediately think of Jesus' persecution, the trials, the beatings, Calvary. We think of, if you've read it, Fox's Book of Martyrs. We think of our missionary, Jesse in Myanmar, who ran from the point of a bullet for 7 years. We tend to think of persecution as that kind of religious persecution, and maybe you've experienced it or maybe not. But persecution is the consistent effort of someone else to diminish you. That's what persecution is. It's someone else's effort to diminish or destroy you. Persecution happens in the schoolyard. It happens in the workplace. It happens at the dinner table. Persecution even happens in the bedroom. Have you ever been around someone who is trying to diminish or destroy you? That's persecution. And Jesus says, flip the script. Those are people in need. Whatever is going on inside of them, they're behaving in a very unattractive way. And Jesus says, your job is to minister to them in love. Persecution is never about what you have done. That'd be called justice or revenge. Persecution is about someone who's so small and diseased inside that they can't stand whole and healthy people in their world. It's acting out an inner need in an unattractive way. And let's go now to Matthew 25. Matthew 25. So we were just at Matthew 5. That's the beginning of Jesus' ministry. We now flip to the end of the book of Matthew, and Jesus is kind of wrapping everything up. He's actually talking about end times judgment here in chapter 25, verses 34 through 40. But it's still on his mind. He's concerned that we have the right approach, the right attitude toward dealing with people that are difficult to deal with. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. You've all heard this before, right? I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous ones will reply, Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or feed you, Or thirsty and gave you something to drink? Or a stranger and show you hospitality? Or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison or visit you? Sick or in prison and visit you? You're the king. You don't go through all that. And Jesus replies, I tell you the truth, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. What a fantastic identification of Christ with the least of these. And I don't know how you think about the least of these, but when I think about them, I think about people who are hungry, thirsty, and naked. Kind of describes babies a little bit, doesn't it? Use your heads, folks. People who are hungry, thirsty, and naked are people who aren't taking care of themselves, are they? They have failed at life's fundamental job of meeting your basic needs. And if they can't manage to get clothing and food, what's going on in their life? Well, these are people that, those of us who are fed and clothed, we find them unattractive. Again, you think of the street beggar. I know many of you are involved in missions in inner city Kansas City, and the unloveliness you see it's overwhelming sometimes, isn't it? When you see these people and their dire needs, and it's only out of a sense of compassion and love that drives you, because I'll bet they're not very nice about it. Linda, do you get thanked every time you help somebody? Not always. Those of you who go down to Hope Faith, those of you who take care of little kids while the parents get services, it's just not always a lovely encounter. People who are strangers are strangers. The sick, the imprisoned. How do you think they got in prison in the first place? By portraying Santa Claus? No, they earned their way there. And so Jesus is saying, don't tell me you love me unless you love everyone. Don't pick and choose who you love. People tend to be unattractive in their area of greatest need, and so we tend to pull away from those people that are unattractive. And Jesus says, I don't want you doing that. This is fascinating, because these verses, Pastor Works coming up with great points of application. Jesus took care of that. Pray for those who persecute you. Meet the needs of people who are in need. It's all right there. It's just amazing. God wants us to do this because He wants us to see people with the dignity and worth that He created them with. He wants us to step over their unloveliness and meet their need. And more importantly, He wants you to not be wounded by them as they act out their need. I'm going to say this. I'm going to work real hard to say this exactly the way I want to. In Olathe, and their surrounding areas, there's a very large population of deaf people. There's the deaf school over there. And let me say this, and then I'm going to say something else. Some of the deaf people I've dealt with are the most conniving and deceitful people I've ever seen in my life. Now, they've spent their entire life trying to live in a world that's not normal, that's different. They're survivors. They are fighting every day to survive. And if you can step over the survival skills that they've developed and meet their needs, your reward is in heaven. Amen? Man. I took money out of my own pocket to buy prescription medicine for 2 kids children of a deaf couple. I picked it up and I went to their house. I'm not making this up. The kids were eating steak in front of a Rent-A-Center TV. And the husband, who had just gotten a gift of money from the church, was out at the Woodlands trying to double up. Didn't make me mad. Broke my heart. How can I help you when you keep acting out your need in such an unlovely way? Oh my goodness. Well, we have this calling from Jesus on our lives that we're to follow, whether we understand it or not. I hope you do. I hope you are thinking of people in your world who tend to be unattractive in their area of greatest need. And if I'm talking about you, if you've got this inner need that's making you unlovely, unlovable, unattractive, I'm going to ask you to talk to God about your hurt. He wants to heal you. He wants to help you. You see these people in this room? They want to help you. Amen? Okay. But we can also be inspired by some great examples. Mother Teresa, you know, she's a person. India, you know, she's whatever. We don't think about her much. We don't think carefully about what she did. Her journey to the cesspool of society is one of the most noble experiences any human has ever lived. Mother Teresa spent half a century caring for, in her own words, the hungry, the naked, the homeless, the crippled, the blind, the lepers, all those who feel unwanted, unloved, uncared for throughout society. People that have become a burden to society and are shunned by everyone. She walked where Jesus Christ walked. Catholic Church is trying to find a miracle she did so they can canonize her and make her a saint. She's a saint. How many of you have read Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place? Does it just blow your... Ugh. Corrie ten Boom, The Hiding Place. Read this book. German gypsy women, they're all in this concentration camp dormitory, 3 bunks high, middle of the night, some German gypsies screaming, "Steiner, Steiner!" Just waking everybody up, making a huge racket. Finally, Corrie figured out they wanted bedpans. And where everybody else in the camp was telling them, "Shut up," Corrie ten Boom got down out of her bunk in the middle of her night, found her way to the latrine, and got the bedpans. Concentration camp, middle of the night, bad food, bedpans. And took them to these women. You want to shut somebody up? Meet their needs. Unbroken. How many of you have read this book? Read this book. It's going to be a movie next year. Mother Mary, we're going to take you to that. Unbroken. Louis Zamperini was persecuted. He would have been the guy who broke the 4-minute mile instead of Roger Bannister. Instead, he signed up for the military, the Second World War. He said, "I'm going to serve my country." He's shot down trying to rescue other people. He spends longer lost at sea than any other person. And that was just the beginning of his ordeal. Watching his friends get eaten by sharks and shot by Japanese planes flying overhead. He gets rescued to go into a gulag, a prison camp, just a hellhole run by the Japanese. He was persecuted. They knew he was a man of some notoriety because he had performed in the Olympics and all this stuff. And they brutalized him. They just brutalized him. They did everything short of ending his life, and he would have prayed that they had. They brutalized him. There was one guy who particularly had it out for him. And day after day after day, this Japanese prison camp honcho would just brutalize Louis Zamperini. Finally, read this book. Finally, the war ends. Louis Zamperini goes home. He gets saved at a Billy Graham rally. He spends tens of thousands of dollars of his own money, months of his life, traveling back to Japan, trying to find this Japanese murderer so he could forgive him. If you want to know what Jesus walking around looks like, this is it. And I'll tell you something else. America is a great nation. As a nation, we have emulated Christ so much. When the war ended, our prisoners were starving in the Japanese prison camps. Within hours of the war ending, planes that had dropped bombs on Japan were dropping food into the prison camps. And our prisoners, who had been brutalized, shared their food with their captors. It's easy to hate. It's easy to turn our back on people who have hurt us, who have wounded us, who have behaved in an unlovely way. It's easy to do that, but it's not the right thing. I want to tell you about a guy named Roy. I moved to another land one time. My first encounter with Roy, I took a church in the East Coast, and my first encounter with Roy, I was buying a house for sale by owner, but Roy was an elder in the church, and he was a real estate agent. So I asked his opinion of what I was doing. And he chewed me out. This is my first blush with the guy. He chewed me out for spending too much on this house. I should go buy a much less expensive house and feed my retirement or something. I don't know, but whatever it was, I didn't meet his expectation. By the way, I flipped that house in 3 years for 20% profit. So the next blush with Roy was, for some reason, he was in charge of the benevolence fund. He was the least benevolent person you've ever met, and I realized this was horrible. I wound up turning people away who came by the church for support because it was easier to turn them away than it was to deal with Roy to get a check out of him. Now, elders are supposed to be the spiritual leaders of the congregation. They're supposed to join with the pastor and shepherd the flock. That's the expectation I have for elders. So me and the elders, we'd meet once a month, and I many times wished I was in a Japanese prison camp because Roy would not leave me alone. If I said we ought to put more water in the baptistry, he'd argue with me. He'd give 10 reasons why we should. Everything I said, Roy was fussing at me. And it became toxic. Not just between me and Roy, but all the meetings were just shot to high heaven. Well, I got to a point where I had enough, and I wasn't going to leave the church, not with Roy. So I wrote a letter. I invited him into my office, and I handed him the letter. and I told him he was going to resign. Now, that may not be how it's supposed to be done, but that's how I did it. And I didn't know what he was going to do. I mean, he had been so cantankerous with me, I didn't know if he was going to punch me. Or if he was going to storm out and tell all the other elders what a jerk I was, and this kid's got to go and all. I didn't have the idea that we had come to the end of the line. His unattractiveness was killing me. I said it had to stop. Roy bent over in the chair. We were seated next to each other. He bent over and he began to cry. And he continued to cry. And his body quaked with tears and weeping. I put my arm on his back, and I just let him cry. I figured whatever's going, he has it coming. I said, Roy, after a long period of time, I said, Roy, what's going on? And in this childlike voice, Roy says to me, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. They keep electing me elder, but I don't know what to do. So I said, I just thought I was supposed to keep you in check. Roy resigned as elder. He and I went to lunch at least once a month for the rest of my term there, and I call him a very good friend. It doesn't have to be some big calamity. Just being out of your element can cause you to be a horribly unattractive person. Jesus doesn't call us to fix people who tend to be unattractive in their area of greatest need. He calls us to pray for them. He calls us to minister to them. That will be the hardest thing you ever do as a human. But as a follower of Jesus Christ, that is the least that you can do. People tend to be unattractive in their area of greatest need. We aspire to a higher calling to meet needs, no matter how unattractive. And so, I charge you. I started to say, find those people. They find you, don't they? You know who they are. You may ride home with one today. Maybe not. No hang. Follow Jesus and minister to people in need.